right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Whitehead Reading Group. Welcome to this Good Friday session. We expect that we'll have fewer people. We didn't necessarily plan to overlap with this today, but it's good to be in community with all of you. I'm Brian Donaldson. I'm at the University of California, Irvine, and actually this week I'm coming in from Austin, Texas. And yeah, just really looking forward to our time together. Just a reminder that we are recording today's session. And then per the last email, we're going to have 3 more sessions of this reading group, and those dates are on the screen. And then we'll just take a break, and hopefully our time together has gotten everyone maybe activated in new ways, maybe to participate in some of the upcoming Whitehead conferences, and Brian will say a little bit more about that. So welcome.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Brian Henning. I'm a professor of philosophy.
Brian, you're muted.
No?
Am I?
Oh, no, you're not. Go ahead.
I could hear it.
Hello, everybody. So I'm glad to be with you today. I wanted to share with you some of our just reminders. So the first is that we just had our first quarter update. If you don't already get these go out, once a quarter, update of what progress we've made with the critical edition. And if you go to the Whitehead Research website, whiteheadresearch.org, and on the right-hand side, you can subscribe to our blog, and then you'll get these updates in your inbox regularly. The second thing is just simply to keep reminding you of the conference that we'll be holding at the end of the summer virtually. And so that conference will be successful if you are willing to get a copy of the second volume of the critical edition that just came out and take a look at it and maybe consider submitting a paper. Those proposals are due June 30th. And if you are interested at all, it might be a good idea to go ahead to maybe Joe can post in the chat the link to this conference page and just register to attend, and so that you're set up to be able to attend that hopefully this summer. So those are our 2 updates. Joe, am I forgetting anything else that would be update worthy?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, it's nice to be with all of you today, and I'm happy to turn it over to Joe Pettit.
Okay. So hello again, everyone. Last time I talked about the we talked about the Freedom and Order essay, which I sadly wasn't able to tell you very much about, but I promised I'd have more for you.
Hey, Joe, you should probably introduce yourself, bud.
Oh, well, yeah, I think most of you have been here before, but my name is Joe Pettit, and I'm the chief archivist and assistant editor for the critical edition of Whitehead, coming to you from Wisconsin. Anyway, to get into this, a lot of what makes these letters interesting is the timing of them. That is that these happened well before he began writing philosophy professionally. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about what was going on in Whitehead's life around this time, and then a little bit about his transition from mathematician to philosopher. But actually, before I even start with that, I wanted to point out that at the time when we decided that this was going to be our next reading, we weren't aware that the first long letter to Russell's Problems of Philosophy actually had been written about once before by Victor Lowe, Whitehead's biographer, for the Russell Journal in 1974. And if I'd known that, then I would have posted a link to that short article as additional background reading for today. But we discovered it so late that there just wasn't time. For what it's worth, though, I've now updated the page on today's reading with a link to that article, and I'm also going to put a direct link into the chat right now for you. So there that is. Thankfully for me, Lowe's article doesn't contradict anything that I already thought about this letter, but it does give a few little extra facts and context that are nice to know. And that's stuff that I'll include in what I'm about to tell you. So let's start out with the end of Whitehead's career at Trinity. He had attended Trinity College, Cambridge, starting in 1880. And after earning his degree in 1884, he had immediately been elected a fellow and become a lecturer in mathematics for 26 years until 1910. What happened in 1910? Well, a colleague and friend of Whitehead's in the math department named Andrew Forsyth fell in love and eloped with a married woman. He resigned both his chair and his fellowship at Trinity with Whitehead, but Whitehead hoped that the Trinity College Council would allow Forsyth to keep the fellowship, since he was a friend and had served the school well for decades. But a motion to ask Forsyth to reconsider his resignation got nowhere, and in the end, his resignation was accepted by a vote of 8-4. Whitehead was not alone in being angry at the decision, as 27 fellows would subsequently protest the acceptance of Forsyth's resignation. And Whitehead responded ultimately by resigning his own lectureship about 2 months later, then moved from Cambridge to London without first lining up a new job. The Forsyth affair was apparently not the only reason for Whitehead's departure from Trinity. He told Victor Lowe that he had been, quote, in a groove in Cambridge and needed a change of scenery. And interestingly enough, Forsyth would gain a new chair in mathematics at Imperial College in 1913 and end up hiring Whitehead for a position under him a year later. But Whitehead was unemployed for the 1910-1911 academic year. He used the time to write an introduction to mathematics and continue finalizing the proofs for the latter 2 volumes of the Principia Mathematica with his former student and longtime collaborator, Bertrand Russell. He would accept a position to be lecturer in applied mathematics and mechanics at the University of London in July 1911. And it was only a month after accepting this position that Whitehead wrote the first letter that we're looking at today, a critique of Russell's manuscript for his book, The Problems of Philosophy, which was Russell's first book on philosophy generally, though he had written books and articles on specific philosophical topics previously. In any case, when Whitehead wrote his criticisms, he was still teaching and focusing solely on the mathematics that had been his entire career up to that point. But when exactly did Whitehead become interested in philosophy and begin to seriously consider starting on a new career path? That's where the fascination in these letters lies, because we can't really say with any great exactness. The most concrete marker for when Whitehead can be said to have entered professional philosophical circles was when he joined the Aristotelian Society in 1915, joining such contemporaries as Russell, C.D. Broad, Lord Haldane, Samuel Alexander, Lloyd Morgan, and others. When he read his first paper to the Society in 1915, he referred to himself as, quote, an amateur in philosophy. And in his autobiographical notes published in his Library of Living Philosophers volume in 1941, Whitehead himself considered his philosophical writing to have begun near the end of World War I with his Principles of Natural Knowledge. So the entry into the Aristotelian Society was in 1915, 4 years after these letters. We don't really know much of anything about his philosophical development in the intervening time. But what about in the other direction? It's been said that the first course in philosophy that Whitehead attended was his own at Harvard in 1924. This may be true, but doesn't quite give the whole picture. Whitehead talked in his autobiographical notes about how he had many intense intellectual discussions with friends in his time at Trinity, leading to a lot of, quote, miscellaneous reading, including a close study of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in the mid-80s, 1880s, that is. Most notably, Whitehead was a member of an elite and secret discussion group at Cambridge known as the Cambridge Apostles, which freely discussed a broad range of topics, including ones with philosophical implications. And it's worth noting that Whitehead himself nominated J.M.E. McTaggart for membership in the Apostles, who would become a staunch Hegelian, leading Whitehead to later admit that he had been influenced by Hegel without having read him through his discussions with McTaggart and Lord Haldane. Happily, the Apostles actually did make a practice to record some of the topics discussed and how their members responded to questions posed. Now, we might actually be able to fill a whole reading group session just talking about some of Whitehead's responses to these prompts from the apostles, but for now, I'll just shotgun a few of the more interesting ones, some of which may dovetail into our discussion of these letters to Russell. A question put before the apostles in February 1885 was, quote, "Does the devil exist, or is he merely loathsome?" Whitehead was one of two members who voted yes and commented that, quote, "He is the homogeneous," which seems to point to his early conviction that absolute sameness is evil. 2 weeks later, to the question, Democritus or Heraclitus, he responded, Heraclitus, for whom change was a key concept, an incessant transformation. A few years later, when asked whether we have a criterion of progress, Whitehead voted no. To the question, facts or feelings, Whitehead responded, of course, feelings. In May of 1885, it was asked whether the members believed in God and if a personal God was a satisfactory explanation of the universe, to which Whitehead responded, yes. I could go on, as Lowe reports more of Whitehead's responses to such questions in the first volume of his Whitehead biography. But to bring it back to our reading, the larger point is that Whitehead had participated in vigorous philosophical discussion with the apostles in his 20s. And so this had this as a sort of background philosophical foundation. He was also elected to a fellow of the Philosophical Society in 1887, but he never read a paper to it. In any case, he did not have any formal philosophical training, really. So we have Whitehead's discussions with the apostles in his youth on the one hand, and his entry into the Aristotelian Society and the proper beginning of his philosophical career in 1915 or so on the other hand. So what we have here in these Whitehead letters of 1911 to Russell is the philosophical critique of a man who had an interest in philosophical discussion from decades earlier, but no formal training and probably no notion yet that philosophy might be a discipline to which he had something to contribute. He even refers to himself in the first letter as a plain man multiple times, saying that, quote, "all philosophy is unplausible to us." Now, maybe this is an overly romantic notion of mine. It may well be overstating the case, but the thing I find most intriguing about these letters, particularly the first two, is that it seems at least plausible that they may represent, if not the moment, then at least a moment when Whitehead's entire career trajectory and interest suddenly began to shift. In the first letter, he says to Russell that, quote, "You seem to me to lack self-confidence, or rather time, to systematize philosophy afresh in accordance with your own views." I think it's fairly easy to see that this was Whitehead's wish more than it was Russell's, who was, as Whitehead put it, simple-minded and more sure than Whitehead would ever be that he'd already gotten things sorted out from a philosophical, metaphysical perspective. It was Whitehead who was unsure in his muddle-headed way and felt the urge to start afresh. Consider then that his next letter about his epiphany on time and space came just a week later, that his first paper delivered to the Aristotelian Society 4 years afterward was on space, time, and relativity, and that he ended the letter by saying that, quote, "The general result seems to me to help a naive realism," which he had seen Russell as arguing against by the trick of, quote, "taking away the table by sleight of hand." Given all this, it seems possible that Whitehead spent that intervening week with his brain churning away at the philosophical topics raised by Russell in his manuscript, that they led to his first philosophical epiphany, as it were, about time and space, and that it may have been this, or at least partly this, which ultimately propelled him into his entire storied philosophical career. And again, this may well be an overreach as a conclusion, but it does to me seem possible. And so I'm very interested to hear what other people thought of these letters, and particularly what longtime Whitehead scholars see in them in terms of their connections and divergences from his mature thought. But before I end, I wanted to point out one other thing from the Lowe article I mentioned earlier. Apparently, Russell's correspondence with his friend Gilbert Murray shows that he probably sent the final typescript of his book, Problems of Philosophy, off to the publisher before he even received any of Whitehead's feedback. But as I'd concluded through my own reading, Russell doesn't seem to have directly responded or shifted any of his positions in the book due to Whitehead's criticisms. Lowe points out that the only thing which might be an acknowledgement of the points that Whitehead brought up was a footnote added to the second edition of the book about Kant, which I'm going to paste into the chat now for everyone's convenience before I read it. Okay, here it is. Quote, Kant's thing in itself is identical in definition with the physical object, namely it is the cause of sensations. In the properties deduced from the definition, it is not identical, since Kant held, in spite of some inconsistency as regards cause, that we can know that none of the categories are applicable to the thing in itself. So this would appear to be Russell's short answer to Whitehead's points about Kant. Anyway, I'll stop there, and thanks again to everyone for listening to all my blather. And with that, I'll hand it back to Briette.
And would
yeah.
I be able to ask a quick question to Joe before we
Yeah,
move
yeah,
on?
of course. Blather on. I love it.
Well, I'm interested, Joe, if you could say a little bit more about, Lowe brings up, and I'm bringing this forward because we didn't have a chance to circulate this essay that's in the link there, the Russell article by Lowe. But one of the things that Victor Lowe mentions is the timing when Whitehead would have gotten the proofs, and whether or not, I think you hinted at this, whether or not it was already done, it was already submitted, the final manuscript was already submitted, so that should we really be harsh on Russell for having, did he ignore them, or was it really nothing he could particularly do about changing them? That's question number one. And then and two, just sort of a version of that question, Lowe points out that Russell thanks G.E. Moore and John Maynard Keynes for their help, doesn't thank Whitehead. Now that seems to me to be more noteworthy because, right? And I can't help but think of the fact that, and you remind me of the details here, that Keynes Whitehead was on Keynes's dissertation committee.
Yeah.
Whitehead rejected his first dissertation draft, and Keynes was pissed about it, from what I recall, and didn't thank Whitehead in his dissertation either, even though he named everybody else on the committee. So I'm asking you to gossip maybe a little bit, or just try and get some texture on whether or not there's a slight going on here. If so, what kind it is.
Yeah, so as far as the first question, because I guess that's easier to answer and less speculative, but it seems like, yes, Russell had probably submitted the manuscript at about the same time that he sent it to Whitehead. So in that sense, he wasn't able to kind of freely edit it before submission in response to Whitehead's criticisms, but he should have also received Whitehead's response before like the page proofs were sent to him for correction. So he potentially could have made some corrections there or added some things. Then again, I don't know how strict they were at the time about editing proofs and adding stuff, or that would have involved actually changing some of what he'd done. So maybe it wasn't that realistic of a possibility. So in that sense, maybe we can't criticize Russell too much. He did just add that one footnote in a later edition, but that was about it as far as we can tell. But anyway, as far as the second question, I don't know that it was maybe necessarily meant to be a slight. I think maybe they just had different views, and after all, Whitehead again considered himself a philosophical amateur at this point. I mean, the Keynes thing was different. That was a funny deal, because it was like Whitehead literally came out a year later after having read it a second time and said, "Oh, I read it more carefully this time and I understood it better, and so now I'm passing you," basically. And it's like, oh my goodness. I don't think that was the case here, for what that's worth. I can only speculate, really.
Thanks, you two. We're going to do questions as we've done in the past, but make a slight change. So we'll do using the chat. I'm going to do 3 question rounds today. The first one will be kind of a lightning round, and then we'll move on to 2 other questions. So hopefully we'll get to hear from each other. In order to just get the kind of pulse of how people felt about these letters, the first round I wanted to do was just to ask for initial impressions. And so just giving you 60 seconds, I'll put a timer on. And as we've done before, you'll type your response into the chat box, and then just don't hit enter until I invite you to at the end of the time. That'll just get us a way to kind of set maybe a starting point for where people are at in these letters, because they're so different from the previous readings. And then we'll take a look at some more content directed questions. So just to get a first thought, what are some initial impressions you have? I'll set a clock for 60 seconds and I'll see you on the other side.
Brianne, just so everybody has it, could you post that question in the chat too?
Okay, we are at 60 seconds. As you're ready, go ahead and populate that chat. Let's see what we've got for some initial impressions. All right, now you all can follow along here. We're gonna start in the chat with Rudiger. Was surprised about the very early germ of his later concept of time. Great, we're gonna take up that question in a moment, so maybe we can get into that a little more. Ruth says, for myself, I see beginning impressions, particularly from letter 2, toward the formation of an underlying logic behind Whitehead's philosophy of organism. And let's see, Eric says, Whitehead was no philosophical amateur. In other autobiographical bits, he talks about having read the classical philosophers in school. He seems to be far ahead of Russell, actually. Also, I believe that his use of, quote, plain man is a reference to Russell's, quote, normal spectator. No problem, Ruth. Wherever you are and whatever you're using, welcome. Matt says, I was particularly struck by the second letter wherein Whitehead records his discovery of the relational theory of time. As this was late 1911, I'm wondering to what extent Whitehead was already aware of Einstein's. STR, help someone? Anyone? String, STR?
Relativity.
Thank you. If he wasn't, when did he become so? Presumably prior to 1915, when he presented his paper on relativity at the Aristotelian Society. But we can see how already in 1911, Whitehead was diverging from Einstein as he rejected the idea of instants. Miriam says, I like the intimacy of the letters, humanizing Whitehead. As a not proper philosopher, it was somewhat comforting to read Whitehead describing himself as a novice philosopher. Great, welcome, Miriam. Benjamin says, I definitely saw these as showing continuity with Whitehead's later philosophy, and agree with Pettick that Whitehead's comment about, quote, systemizing philosophy afresh, end quote, indicates a perhaps growing desire of his. Mario says, he shows some ideas really early, like the criticisms to atomism of sense data, or the object with parts in space as well as in time. A couple more here. Mark says, I love the focus on perception, foreshadowed by the first line in the last reading, and closed with his reflection on his life in different periods at the end of the last letter. Juan says, I was struck by Whitehead's incisive comments on the issues of universals, specifically how his critique of the example, quote, Edinburgh is north of London, end quote, and how it may lead to the second letter on his epiphany of time. Thank you, Matt, and great. Wonderful. I was surprised that no one mentioned what I first thought when reading the first letter, which was, ouch. And maybe Brian kind of gestured toward this a little bit. Like, I just tried to imagine being a student receiving a letter like that, and I think it would be quite a blow. And it kind of gave me, and now Brian, you raised a set of questions that made me even, that he didn't pass having when you hear these horror stories of people who aren't, who have a dissertation advisor that seems to just really resist helping one come through. I don't know. I almost have this new feeling that's emerging that I've never associated with Whitehead, which is kind of like maybe was he not pleasant? Like, would you not want to get together and chat with him? I don't know. I don't know. No, none of you seem to raise these questions, but if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them. All right, we're going to go on to our second question. And let me just pull it up so I can stick it in the chat.
Ruth had a quick question or a comment.
Yeah, please.
If you don't mind breaking up the rhythm a little bit.
No, please do.
Oh, hi, Brianne. I'm responding to that commentary you just made about the first letter, Brianne. And I have to say that as a philosophy student, it struck me as very unfortunately familiar, austere, and just par for the course. I read it completely opposite. I just thought, well, yeah, he's definitely got a different perspective. But I think in philosophy, it's actually much like in coming from a science background too. Like, no, you have it all wrong is a very common statement. It's not, that's how I read it, but I can see what you're saying. But I have to say, from a side of being, I have some very austere mentors in my program as well. And it's like, I'm so used to this kind of back and forth. So I have wanted to put that into this.
Well, Ruth, you must have skin like an elephant, just thick.
I don't even know at this point. I'm like a machine. Feeling what is feeling.
Well, we're glad to have you. You'll probably have some special insights because maybe your ego wasn't as flattened as mine felt.
Just thank you.
All right, I'm going to put this second question. This one will give you a longer period of time. We're thinking about letter commentary 1. Some of you are already referring to some of these things, but can you identify a concept in the first letter that Whitehead seems to take up in a later work? And can you identify anything about how it evolves? So for this, I'll go ahead and put 3.5 minutes on the clock. And if you do have a page or a sentence, feel free to put that in, because Brian sometimes can pull us a passage up. And then we'll still do one more question round after this. So regarding, with also a wildcard option that you can ask anything. So go ahead and let's take 3.5 minutes. You put your answer in the chat, hold it until the end of the 3.5 when I invite you to press enter, and then we'll populate the chat together. All right, see you in 3.5.
And Brianne, for quoting pages, should we use the transcript, the transcription, or the handwritten, and should we use PDF pages or actual leaf pages? Just so when people cite, they'll.
Such
I was
good
thinking
questions.
to use the. How about the transcription?
I think
and
transcription.
Maybe PDF pages. So if you look at the transcription of the first letter and then refer to when you cite it, just refer to the PDF page. That'll be easy.
Yeah, the numbers in the vertical lines.
I'll give it, I'll just start the time now, and we'll maybe go to 4 minutes just in case you're wanting to grapple with some pages and open up the transcription document. All right, see you all in a few. For whoever's just joining, you can see a question in the chat. Letter commentary 1, identify a concept that Whitehead seemed to take up in a later work. How does it evolve? And thanks, Brian, for reposting. So if you've just joined, we have about 3.5 more minutes on the clock to weigh in on this in the chat, and I'll invite everyone to enter in a moment. All right, we are at time. So as you're ready, go ahead and hit enter and we'll populate this chat. All right. So I think what we'll do here, let me just kind of scroll down. These are longer thoughts than usual. So I think we'll try to do a few of them and then see if we see any themes or questions emerging and go back to the chat. Eric Alder says, I'd like to say, quote, everything, particularly thinking about page 7, where he discusses, quote, a synthetic unity of apperception, end quote, or quote, the process of formation, end quote, or quote, a permanence of existence superior to that of the perceived phenomenal objects, end quote, or quote, all change is a change of something itself permanent, end quote. But this is Whitehead's recollection of Kant, which might give cause to investigate Kant's influence on Whitehead's mature thought. So I suppose that I'll instead have to say that his distrust of, or his finding inadequacy in language and propositions, which was fundamental to his later work, and is characteristic of his critiques of Russell here, shines through as perhaps original and telling of future directions. Thanks, Eric. Miriam says, the concept of time. Whitehead hints at his, quote, relational theory of time, end quote, how each object, quote, runs its own time, end quote. I laughed out loud when I read his statement about how, quote, mutual relation becomes too complicated for simple logical statement, end quote. That, in a nutshell, is the problem he works through in Process and Reality and his other work. And what a problem it is. That logic distorts what it states to be the case. Quote, with some cooking, we reach the ideal logical simplicity of time and space as usually conceived, end quote. Still working through Whitehead's temporality, but for me, the atomicity of it is logical from one perspective, but illogical from others. It keeps the need for a connection to spatiality, maybe. Let's do one more and then open it up for our audio conversation. Benjamin says, Whitehead is not happy with Russell's account of experience and how we infer from it. And with us merely having, quote, sensations of color, etc., and an imagined physical world which causes it, end quote. This seems like a strong foreshadowing of what would lead him to create the concept of prehension as experiential, direct causal connection to the world, which importantly he does introduce in Science in the Modern World in relation to the problem of induction. Whitehead would from there give a systematic account of the relationship between perceptions in the mode of causal efficacy and presentational immediacy, laying the basis for his own account of how we infer from our perceptions, that is, symbolic reference. Also importantly, Whitehead's recommendation to Russell to appeal, quote, to our judgments as to worth of our affections and of our moral intuitions, end quote, is consistent with his later appeals to naive experience of the more vague but effective and valuative sort. So three really jam-packed thoughts here. So we've got Eric, Miriam, and Ben kind of getting us started. We'll come back to the chat in a bit, but why don't we just open it up for any connections and comments? And if we didn't read your comment and you want to jump in now and just say it out loud or make a connection, please do. It's not my purview to have to read these. I'd much more hear it from you.
And just as a reminder, to participate, one of the best ways to do that is to use your digital hand. If you go to the reactions button at the bottom on your Zoom bar there, you can raise your digital hand. If you have trouble with that, I think I can see all of the squares on my screen. So if you do some hand waving, I or my colleagues will see that too. So feel free to put your virtual hand up or your real hand up, either one. Anybody feel like starting off?
One question I have is I just wonder if maybe together we could think through what I see a few people have raised in the chat, and it also was raised by Eric, is just this connection to Kant, and also Joe also raised this. I wonder if anyone would just want to weigh in on Whitehead, how you just kind of summarize Whitehead's engagement with the thing in itself, or what was unsatisfactory about Russell's take that made Whitehead bring up this aspect of Kant's thing in itself.
And I think that's a good place to start. And just to add to that, I believe he says that he hasn't read him for 20 years, right? Which would have been, as Joe, I think, was mentioning, the 1880s, 1890s, which interested me because by the time he starts teaching at Harvard in the 20s, he's quoting him a lot and is referencing passages from the First Critique in particular quite regularly and expansively throughout those years. So I suspected that maybe he had reread them in quite a bit of detail sometime after 1911 and before 1924. So anyway, just to add to the sort of biographical part, but the Kant question is an interesting one here. Any takers on that? Ruth.
Yeah, I'd like to say something on that. And I'm sorry that I'm the only one speaking so far. So my thought on that is when I Russell, that his perspective is solipsistic, and I think he's saying that from the perspective of his time and also his view and role as a what he would call maybe beginning philosopher. He was already a philosopher, whether he claimed the name or not. Because moving from a place, I think at that point in his journey as a thinker and mathematician, philosopher, he's moving away from something that's more like kind of a Descartesian view, where everything that's not explicable in nature or the soul is explicable via mechanics or mathematics. And that's the solipsistic problem for Whitehead, in my opinion. So he's beginning already to see that science and a non-process form of philosophy, which process wasn't probably even a term he was applying yet, but that non-process view that keeps things locked into the problems of philosophy, like I've mentioned in my chat, dualism, idealism, those kinds of things were not being addressed in a way that was sufficient or acceptable or satisfactory to Whitehead's thinking. And he addresses this, I think, in the way he just says it straight out. This view is problematic. And that's my initial take on the problem. And I think his philosophy was beginning, his thoughts and what he's talking about with Kant is already a way of breaking down that issue, that problem. And that's what his whole philosophy becomes, is a way of resolving it. And it becomes a philosophy of organism and even organic realism, a tricky term as well. But, and I think I see it here very strongly. It's amazing.
Thanks, Ruth. Mario.
Yeah. Hello. Hello.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Well, I actually think that the criticism from Whitehead is sound, because Russell is not distinguishing the thing itself from the transcendental object. So yeah, I think that yeah, Whitehead says he hasn't read Kant for 20 years, but he seems to have a very specific knowledge, yeah, at least from these major ideas from Kant. And well, I don't know if you agree that criticism actually is sound, because Russell made a huge mistake, yeah, by not being able to distinguish the transcendental object from the thing itself. And yeah, that brings the question of how much did Whitehead know about Whitehead? Thank you.
Mario, I wonder if you would just say, could you say what your best understanding is of the difference between the transcendental object and the thing in itself?
All right, I will try. Well, the transcendental object is actually a structure, which a way of organizing the intuitions through categories. Yeah, for instance, substance is one category for Kant, and which is that permanent structure, which relation makes a relation of well, some intuitions, spatio-temporal, this multiplicity of intuitions into one object. No, that's the substance. That's not the thing in itself, because that's already a construct which mixes the application of the categories to the multiplicity of the what Russell calls the sense data. Yeah, and it is already something permanent in there. The thing itself, well, we cannot apply the categories to it or the forms of intuition. So that transcendental object is something which is somehow behind the sense data, because it's not reduced to the sense data. It's a structure, and a permanent one. Whereas the thing itself is beyond all of that. I don't know if I managed to explain myself.
I think you got us well into the river, Mario. Thank you so much. I'll just open it up for anyone else who wants to jump in on this and anything else.
Benjamin.
Yeah, I think the Kant connection is an important one. I actually I thought it was pretty significant that he did go into such detail into Kant in this, because he does also later in Process and Reality spend a bit of time kind of reacting to Kant and in some ways trying to, I guess, supersede him. Like he says, you know, his philosophy offers a critique of pure feeling that therefore makes Kant's critiques unnecessary, which is directly connected with the kind of problems that I put up in the chat, where he isn't satisfied with Russell's account of experience and how we infer from it. He wants to instead bring in that concept of prehension to allow for more of a direct causal basis. So like he says in Process and Reality, with Kant, the process begins with the subject and then there's the construction of the object. He wants to reverse it, begin with the object, and then the subject is constructed off of that. And it does seem like there is already some basis for him trying to think in that kind of way in these letters. So.
Thanks, Benjamin. Eric.
Yes, thank you. And just following up on Benjamin, I think that he's completely right. I would say that I think that I detect here, and I probably need to go back and read Kant, but I think that I detect here what might be a selective reading of Kant. I don't think that Whitehead is exactly. I mean, he's not focusing on the things that Kant actually focuses on, it seems to me, in terms of categories, etc. He's pulling out these ideas that really do seem to be proto-Whitehead ideas, and just to directly follow up on Benjamin, what Benjamin said. Oh gosh, I forgot what I was going to say. Benjamin, what was the last thing you said?
Was it the thing about the process beginning with subject and going to object?
Oh yes, yes.
Object
Thank you.
to subject.
Thank you. Whitehead actually says that in this. In one of those instances where he's talking about the plain man, he says, it's on page 2 of the facsimile. He says, "I see a yellow table and I feel a hard table, and I infer that I feel what I see. You rather obscurely tell me that I see yellowness and feel hardness and infer a real table. Such inferences are quite beyond the plain people like myself. I perceive objects and want to know about the reality of those objects that I perceive." So he makes that idea actually quite explicit here.
I'd like to build a little more on that. I've had this wonder, and I'm curious whether other people have a similar reaction, that when he's talking about the plain man and adopting that as his position from which to evaluate Russell's work, Russell says that he's writing to a message to shop assistants, is the way that he's pitching some problems of philosophy, is a message to shop assistants, right? The plain man. So I wondered if part of what Whitehead is doing here is sort of adopting the audience that Russell says he's speaking to, and then critiquing Russell's work from perspective. And of course, his nascent philosophical views are coming through in doing that. But that when he's referring to plain man, or I'm just a plain man, those things, I take him to be saying as a shop assistant. Lowe brings this up in his article in the journal Russell. He says, let's see if I can, sorry, let me fix this a little bit.
Yeah. When you find your area, Brian, will you enlarge it?
You bet.
Thanks.
So let's see if we could start here, perhaps. Russell was a sense datum theorist for only 6 years. The significance of Whitehead's objections to chapter 1 should not be thus limited, for he identifies his own conviction with that of the plain man, whom Russell continued to regard as mistaken. The conversational phrase, the plain man, is much too rough to fit the real Whitehead, and he does not make it prominent in his writings. Instead, he says such things as in 1915 that science is rooted in common sense thought, and in 1925 that in philosophy the ultimate appeal is to naive experience. His distaste for logical atomism must have been extreme. For a short time in essays published in 1915 and 17, Whitehead presented the perceived table as an unconscious construction out of actual and hypothetical perceptions, which he sometimes called sense objects. He never gave up his opposition to Russell's 1911 view that belief in the public table is an inference from sense data. How much Russell's substitutional constructions for inferences announced in 1914 owed to Whitehead is hard to say, so far as tables are concerned. I am sure only that Russell always attributed to Whitehead the idea of applying this method to reach the space and time of mathematical physics. Whitehead's criticism of the problems does not mention the principle of substituting constructions for inferences, and I doubt that he had yet shown this use of it to Russell. So anyway,
What is
I'm
this
just curious
source,
of other
Brian?
people.
What's this
This
source?
is the Russell article that Victor Lowe wrote
Oh,
in
thanks.
1974.
That the one that Joe put into the chat, right?
Exactly.
At the start of the chat? Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So how much of, I guess to phrase a question, how much of what he says can be seen as an exercise of adopting a perspective that Russell's asking, aiming his book to a particular reader, and Whitehead's critiquing it from that specific perspective. Do you share that sort of, does that seem to be a valid way of evaluating what Whitehead's doing in response to Russell, or not? How much should that be played up or not?
Are you asking everyone?
Yeah. Anyone.
Okay.
My point in bringing it up, I don't know if it matters, is just simply a lot of his critique, which is pretty severe, as Brian was mentioning, when he smuggles away the table. Can you imagine being asked to revise this, given that initial criticism? It's like you start off completely screwing up, and now everything else is wrong, right? You're like, fix it. And you're like, so,
Well,
go ahead, Ruth.
Well, I think he really is, again, he's seeing a very large problem in modern philosophy at the time. And in my opinion, I don't think it really was being addressed. And clearly he's poking at Russell to be like, no, come on, there's more to this, because really, I think the fundamental error, he was looking at these bodies of thought that were problematic to that very argument. I mean, dualism itself is problematic for Whitehead in this example, because you can't separate, it's the issue of like mind and matter as being totally distinct qualities or aspects. They aren't for Whitehead. The area of materialism, throwing the mind out from that first error of dualism, throwing the mind away in materialism, is problematic. And Bertrand and Russell's doing that in his argument, and he's critiquing that. He's also critiquing that you can't just throw the matter away either. These are, to me, like bigger issues he's getting at in probably Western philosophy at the time. And that's what makes him, I think, still one of the, I don't know, under underrepresented like great philosophers of the modern time. These are huge issues that not a lot of philosophers were able to resolve in some of their systematic approaches. And Whitehead, I believe, does it in organic, and the way he eventually gets into that organic philosophy. So that's my own perspective on it.
I appreciate that. As another example from the shop assistant that Russell's writing to, I'm reminded of a way that Whitehead described actual occasions, reality, and our experience with it. He said, correct me, Jill, if I'm getting this wrong. It was he refers to the scrum in oh shoot, what is the not football, but
Rugby.
Rugby. Like the getting hit in rugby, or a drunk man feeling a light pole. He gives these interesting examples of sort of common experience and but weird examples at the same time. And I agree with you, Ruth, that he's trying to then do justice to that, but not by just sort of being simplistic in citing these experiences, but not to allow us to commit the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, or not to smuggle away the real world. And so I like the image of the scrum and as sort of an example of experiencing reality. Yeah, Brienne.
That was helpful. Brian, where does that scrum come from? What was the other one you just said?
Looks like Matt's got a reference there in the chat for the rugby analogy.
Okay.
Joe might be able to track it down for us with a little bit of time as well. And the lamppost one with the drunk person, gosh, I am not remembering. I want to say an A.H. Johnson sort of, is that that's possible? I'll have to do some digging to pull that out.
Yeah, I guess I just this sleight of hand, the phrase, this, you remove the table with sleight of hand, or you smuggle the table away. This is really evocative language, and I also feel afraid when I read Whitehead that I'm running behind a bus and I'm like, I'm not getting it. And I'm like, what does it mean to smuggle the table away? And I think what you just said very succinctly, Brian, was that you're not wanting to somehow distance oneself from the experience of reality, right? That the table needs to be real in some way. Would that be right, Brian?
Yeah, and that our experience with it is pretty, it's to use Peirce's categories, secondness is pretty, you feel that. Or he talks about the sting of your hand with a cricket ball, like you're trying to catch the cricket ball. He uses this to attack Russell quite a bit in his lectures. When you see the cricket ball coming toward you, and you catch it with your hands and you feel the sting, you're not talking about like a patch of sense data, but he uses these British sports analogies because he was a big sports guy himself when he was in school. And so I think that's what I have in mind when he's thinking of smuggling. But that could be wrong. That's just what comes to my mind.
Well, I guess it just, I see Joe's added something here. I just wanted to say that, again, I was thinking about this passage, and what I added here, I think would connect to something we read, was in Science in the Modern World, where Whitehead is, talking about that we feel the warmth of the sun, but we don't perceive the community of electrons and molecules that are vibrating. We feel the hardness of the chair, the softness of the velvet, the greenness of trees. And I wondered if this passage was to say that, like there's perception beyond the five senses, right? This kind of becomes one of the dividing lines with Kant and Hume and Whitehead, right? Which is to say that if we can't experience it, then we can't talk about things, because we can't speak of causality, because we can't feel these things with our senses. So I wondered if this was gesturing toward that, the fact that we're perceiving real reality all the time, with perception beyond the senses. All right, let's see here. We'll do a couple more thoughts, and then we'll get into our next round of questions. So just on point here. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Sorry to grab the screen there. I was just going to share the cricket example. So this is from Harvard lecture, the first volume of the Harvard lectures. Is that big enough?
One more, that's great, thanks.
So ingression is Whitehead's term. So this is from Emerson lecture 8. So this is at the beginning of 1924. Ingression is Whitehead's term for the complexity of a situation. C.D. Broad does refer to a multiple relation theory of Dawes Hicks and G.E. Moore on right lines, but have oversimplified things and therefore get into all sort of difficulties. Whitehead's example of cricket with vivid experience. What the schoolboy is emphatically not doing is classifying the phenomena, not anticipating sensations, but is thinking of the entity itself, the ball. If he were classifying, he would be wavering. What you try really to see is what's apprehending in a moment of stress. The classification display is not what's interesting to you. There's a couple more references to this, and he explicitly gets into to Russell on this, but that we're not inferring the object. we is sort of his cricket example, as I take it, is another instance of the, we're not inferring from experiences to like there must be an object, like this cricket ball is coming at me, I catch it, hurts my hands. There's no inference, and he uses this pretty regularly in Harvard lectures in 1924, 2025. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's great. Joe, I wonder, would you just read your passage here? Joe, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I thought I just.
Sorry.
Yeah, Matt and I posted this at about the same time, but I was able to grab it because I knew I had used it in a chapter of that anthology of essays on HL1. But yeah, Hawking quotes Whitehead as saying, "Being tackled at rugby, there is the real. Nobody who hasn't been knocked down has the slightest notion of what the real is. I used to play in the middle of the scrum. They used to hack at your shins to make you surrender the ball, a compulsory element, but the question was how you took it, your own self-creation. Freedom lies in summoning up a mentality which transforms the situation as against letting organic reactions take their course."
Thanks, Joe, and Matt, thanks. Well, there's some other interesting thoughts coming in the chat, but I'm thinking, let's see, we're at 10:04. Let's get into our last question set and see where we go. And again, always feel free to come in with your audio and offer your thoughts. I'm going to put a couple options here for y'all. Let's see if I can. All right, we've got kind of 3 possible options for you to take. Question 1, a question 2, and a wild card. So you can pick which one of these you want to pick up. I'm going to hit enter. You can see that question 1 is, how do you understand relational time, letter 2, in light of Whitehead's later work? Question 2 is going to be, how do you understand space relations, letter 3, in light of Whitehead's later work? And then wild card, what questions do you have? So all I ask is that as you decide which of these you're going to answer, just use 1, 2, or a wild card, or WC is fine, just so that when I first look, I can see who's answered question 1, who's answered 2, or who's like raising other questions. So let's take 3, about, let's see, maybe 3-ish minutes, and then we'll come back together. So just write your 1, 2, or wild card, and then follow it with whatever thoughts you have. And I'll invite you all to hit enter in about 3.5 minutes. All right, as you are ready, you can start to populate the chat. We'll take a look and see what we've got here. We've got some wild cards. Eric's taken up question 1. I've got a wild card. Mario's taken up 1. Ben's got a wild card. Miriam, I think, is taken. Is that question 2? 1. Let's start with Juan's question for 1. I'd love to hear your thoughts on whether this conversation with Russell on Kant on universals connects with his insight of time could be treated in exactly the same way as I have now got space, which is a picture of beauty, by the by, in the second letter. I see this moment as a key development for his process metaphysics overall. All right, let's see if we've got some other ones. Mario says, through perspectivism, each actual entity concentrates in and from its perspective, its past, future, and simultaneity as possible extensive objects. This being possible because it is itself extended. Oh, you guys. Oh, I'm daunted. And then we've got Eric taking up question 1. Whitehead's conception of relational time, as here expressed, is interesting to consider in terms of his detailed explanation of the process of concrescence and process and reality. There, he notes that all feelings take place in the immediate past, meaning one supposed the infinitesimally immediate past. In this way, Whitehead relieves the concept of temporal simultaneity from his account of processual reality and aligns his theoretical construct with then current understandings of physics. I would invite anyone to try to, if you could take a look at these 3 ones. We've got one from Eric, we've got one from Mario, we have one from Juan. Rudiger, he also says, Whitehead is developing his concept of time and with the idea of simultaneity. Later in Process and Reality, this is fundamental for his definition of past and future. All right. Here's my question. Now, I have to say, this does not sound like plain man philosophy. This is the kind of moment in Whitehead where I just say, I don't know. Would someone be able to take a look at these few responses and just maybe see if you could bring out a few salient points on time for my sake, if not for others?
I would like to jump in. I'm not sure if I'm going to be helpful, Brianne, in answering your request, but I'll tell a little bit of a personal note that I try very hard to have Whitehead be a crucial component in my dissertation, and I quite couldn't make it happen. Long story. So for those working on dissertations, stay strong. You may come back later. But years after, when I was liberated to do what I wanted, at the time in which it was 2005, the miraculous year of Einstein was being celebrated, I put my effort on looking into Whitehead, especially his theory of relativity, and that's a mouthful. And it's very interesting because particularly the move of difference between Einstein's account of special theory of relativity, which both in a sense, especially Einstein, is the one that gives us the concept of time being now relative, being able to be not just independent as a universal, independent of experience that had to be accounted as part of the event. Whitehead wanted to add a shift. He recognized that Einstein wasn't going far enough, and I feel, and I'm probably going, I shouldn't say this, but I think he knew very well by 1911 Einstein's paper of 1905. I'm very sure he knew special relativity very well, right? So the thing that bothered him was how, kind of like Bergson and then William James both were suggesting that time needs to play a different role. And so to me, this moment in which he's criticizing Russell on his use of universals by saying, look, you cannot say that there's something there when you say north of London, Edinburgh, there it is, that there's a missing component. And his insight to me of, oh, that's it, if we take an object and in the same way that is extended in space, it is extended in time, but fundamentally, not as a, we have the object and then we can have it moving. That is what he felt it was missing from Einstein's theory of relativity. And he went on to create his own version, in fact. So to me, he took that very seriously. I see it as a crucial moment. And then later we see a whole bunch of different concepts developed, I think, from this moment. But I have to say I'm biased because that's what I encountered in 2005 when I was putting together my thoughts on Einstein, and I use Whitehead heavily. So I'll keep it short, but there's a lot there, and I wish we have a few more hours on this.
Eric, please.
I think Juan is largely correct. I would like to state, before I say anything else, that Einstein, when he spoke philosophically about time, he spoke in the exact same way that Whitehead does. And I think that we can think about Whitehead's ideas of societies having temporal thickness here, meaning that real objects are not simply in the three dimensions. They also exist in a sort of, well, I like his term, temporal thickness. And this is highly related to what we often call worm theory today, whereby we can sort of, I mean, we can't imagine it, I don't think, but we can imagine an object existing sort of as a worm through time, in all of its various slices, which is, very relevant to how Whitehead often describes complex objects, complex actual entities. But I think here the real interest in these early statements on time exists in this idea. I'm sorry. I also, Juan, I completely agree with you. I firmly believe that Whitehead had already read, despite what the people at Stanford say, I firmly believe that he had already read the special theory of relativity at this point in 1912. It's just too, similar to not have occurred. But I think what's really interesting here and what's impactful, as I was trying to get across, is this idea that as Einstein states, we can't be certain of temporal simultaneity. Because as Whitehead says in this letter, I believe it's in this one and not the third letter, he says that every object, and he says, myself included, I'm paraphrasing greatly, has its own time. It has its own existence in the trajectory of time, whatever that trajectory may be. And so this idea that coupled with the idea that feelings take place immediately after the spatial encounter of two objects, really not only aligns us with Einstein's theory of relativity and produces some of the interesting parts of Whitehead's theory of relativity, but it also aligns us with the possibility of quantum theory, which I think is incredibly important for Whitehead and is not generally talked about, whereby in Whitehead terms, actual entities can come into existence free of any time, any linear time in the system. They can come into existence and disappear within their own references as actual entities. I fear that I've just muddied things, but that's what I'm thinking.
And I feel like I made you go in that direction. I want to say a quick thing, and I'm glad if the conversation goes somewhere else. But Einstein, and I disagree slightly, Eric, on one point. I think Whitehead worked really hard to point out a key difference with Einstein's concept of time. And it sounds very similar because they're saying same things about simultaneity, But one of the things he worked on, and it's very evident, that's why I love when you say about quantum mechanics. Einstein was on quantum mechanics, we haven't even read about this, is he had a fundamental problem with it. He felt that the theory was incomplete, meaning he couldn't deal with the concept of probability, chance being built into the theory. So he rejected it, and the famous Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen thought experiment, EPR, was something that he couldn't accept. Whitehead accepted it. And to me, the difference is, and there's a comment on the chat about this, Whitehead saw time not as a fixed, already going thing in which then we can map ourselves into, but rather being built with experience. It wasn't there early. That's why he has some missteps, I think. But later in the more mature theory, he saw time as not already there, and we happen to be in it, which is a Bergson critique against Einstein. I'm sorry to muddle waters, but I think that that's a crucial point, I think, to me always, to understand Whitehead's concept of time. The work on relativity, the work obviously on the metaphysics, but also his comments and critique of quantum mechanics, especially Einstein's view. Sorry to muddle the waters further.
Just to bring this back to the time period and Joe's original comments, do we have a sense in the group, and maybe we could even use the yes/no feature in the reactions, so I'll try and formulate a yes/no question. Is there enough evidence here to suggest that this is the earliest instance of seeing Whitehead's view of time on display from what you know? Would you say yes or no that this could be seen as sort of the first clear instance of his what will become his theory of time? Yes or no? And like the philosopher cats you are, you're heading in all sorts of different directions as to be expected. Mario maybe has a comment about my question, I suspect. Or are you just saying yes? I'm not sure. You're just saying yes?
Sorry,
okay.
I'm sorry. Let's see, yes.
Okay, I got you. Okay. Would it be okay, Brian, if I took the privilege of sort of focusing us on my wild card? Is that okay? I'm really curious what people think about.
Please do.
I just don't know what to make of at the end of letter 1 when he says, here, I'll post it in the chat again, just so everybody has it at the top. When he says, you've entirely failed to convince me that there is such a universal as whiteness. And we all know his, what becomes eternal objects and his sort of inversion of Plato. And he talks a lot about greenness, but as an example in his Harvard lectures 13 years later. I wasn't sure whether just to say that Russell failed, but that he's not rejecting the idea. Anyway, does anybody else have a way of interpreting this given what we know he then goes on to do? Or maybe I'm just taking it out of context. If I can bring it up quickly, I could show what it is that Lowe says about it, and I'm not sure whether to agree with his way of putting it or not. Let me see if I can share again real fast, just because I'd love to know whether you all agree with Lowe on this or not. Is that big enough? So this passage here. Oh no, sorry, that's not the right one. Sorry. Apologies, 1 second. I thought I had it queued up and I did not. That was a mistake on my part. Apologies. Go on without me. I will locate it because now my screen's on.
Well, I just was going to say that while everyone's thinking on this, Miriam, I think says something that maybe is aligned with what Juan and Eric were talking about. That what in this example of the feeling the ball, the cricket ball coming, I must catch it. time is bound with stuff as happening rather than stuff happening in time. I'm thinking there's a connection there between what was just said. And there's another wild card question from Ben just asking about other philosophers that Whitehead might be engaging at this point. Yeah, and I see you're connecting with Brian's idea of secondness. Brian, what do you have? Do you want to just finish us out with that passage?
Yeah, I think so. Whitehead's opening paragraph about chapter 9 is bound to surprise us. I think that, in fact, he no more disbelieved in universals such as whiteness than in an external world. In both cases, the argument from consideration of simplicity is not what convinces the plain man. It may be, however, that Whitehead at this time was resisting the addition of whiteness to the white here and white there, which we discern in apparent nature. Because of course we know that he doesn't believe they exist separately, independently. It was just stated so directly and strongly, it just surprised me that he sort of rejected, it sounded like he was rejecting universals altogether, but that doesn't match anything else we know about him otherwise. As much as Dewey would like him to go that direction and just get rid of them altogether. In terms of closing out, I did have an alternative idea for just to sort of put a nice bow on this really lovely conversation we've been having, and to continue to encourage us to look at the Harvard Lectures. In Harvard Lectures 2, and I've been kind of putting some of these passages down below, but I love this one as this is a 1924 or 5. The object is a permanent group of character of conditioning with spatiotemporal relations. If mankind does in any real sense observe such objects, then what science does is to achieve a more precise rendering of the perceptual objects, which are somewhat vaguely defined and observed. And in doing so, produces electromagnetic field, the electron, etc. Other theories, the lump of chalk is merely, that's my view. Other people say the lump of chalk is merely classes or groups of sense data, which is Whitehead, he says he poked Russell to readopt this after his excellent little Problems of Philosophy, which is of course what we're looking at. Whitehead's only objection to this theory is that he doesn't think it's true, which I could imagine him saying in class, and kind of makes me giggle because that's pretty, again, my only disagreement with it is I think it's wrong. So, and then he gives the cricket example. Illustrations in terms of cricket catching the ball that stings the hands. It's the object exhibiting the color that interests you, not the display of sense data. And so he just really continued, I guess, all into the 20s to think that, and he assigned other books of Russell's, but I don't think he ever found this book to be accurate, useful, correct. He thinks he's fundamentally wrong, I think. Yeah, Eric.
Sorry, I'll keep this very brief. I just want to point out, you raise a really good question here, I think, because I think that this may actually contradict his later ideas, it seems to me. In this where he's critiquing Russell, the chapter is actually called The World of Universals. And Russell is bringing in Plato's idea of the forms, right? And he's saying that these things that Plato conceived of as forms are real universal objects, essentially, as I read him, which of course, particularly given the color analogy, we know that later Whitehead will refer to these things as eternal objects, right? So for him, they become a special class of real things, which are in some ways universal as potentialities of the nature of our universe. So it seems to me that Whitehead's opinion here may have actually shifted in some way from the time that this was written.
That was my wonder. I was trying to interpret it in a way that wasn't the implication, but when I just that sentence, I thought, wow, either his views changed or I'm missing what he's saying here relative to Russell, and so I wasn't sure which one it was.
I think we are ready to wrap up today. I don't know about y'all, but my paper is full, my mind is full. Really, This is great. Joe or Brian, do you have anything about anything you want to give us a heads up in terms of our next reading?
Yeah, well, I will just say for the next reading, I think this one, I mean, I'm glad we did this, but I think this was definitely probably the hardest thing we did. I mean, it requires more background knowledge and it's a little less accessible. This next thing is a little more accessible to return, but it's also kind of a cool thing in terms of the form of it, because what our next reading is Whitehead's presentation during Richard Clark Cabot's social ethics seminar in 1926. And the neat thing about it is that it is not just student notes and it's not even a Whitehead manuscript, but as far as we can tell, it is actually literally a stenographer's account of exactly what Whitehead said in the class, along with all of the ensuing discussion that took place. And there's some weird circumstances that led to that happening. As far as we know, this is completely unique. There's nothing else like this. And we think it happened basically because Cabot wanted to keep an account of these proceedings in this class, and he was independently wealthy, kind of filthy rich, and so he could afford to hire a stenographer to keep an exact account of everything. So I'm excited to take a look at that, and it's actually from HL2. This is something that we published in the recently published book, and we've gotten permission from Edinburgh University Press to share it with everyone. So it's up on the website now and free to download, and I hope everyone enjoys it.
I'm really
Oh,
excited about this one
Yeah.
because he doesn't write on ethics and very regularly. Well, we don't have anything published, but scattered comments. And so I'm really excited for this one and hope it's a teaser to have us all get the second volume of the lectures. And this would be, something you could think about responding to. It's an odd one too. And I look forward to Joe's summary of the weird context of this piece. Will be a lot of fun. But sorry, Brian, go ahead and close this out.
No, I mean, this is it. I mean, just what a great day. I mean, Joe and Brian, again, just major thanks for all that you're doing to help pull this together, and to everyone who's with us today. It's such a joy and delight. We're going to have 3 more meetings after this one, and hopefully we'll just be able to keep our conversation going. For those of you celebrating Good Friday, good thoughts to all of you, and thanks for spending time with us today. Look for an email in the coming week, and we'll meet up here in 3 weeks. Thanks a lot.